Hello and welcome to the MJ Rowe Music Show, and today it feels a bit weird that we're going to be looking back upon the 2010s in the same way we would look upon the 70s, 80s or 90s, somewhere where in hindsight you can look at it nostalgically, look at all the trends or genres or particular styles that emerged in the music. And looking back, there have been a ton of great albums. Like, this was a decade where, when going through, I had a ton of those, I was born in the wrong generation, the music's terrible now, Camila Cabello, Meghan Trainor, wish I was born in the 80s, that sort of thing. But now looking back, I've seen like mega tons of albums that I've absolutely loved throughout this decade, and particular styles that have emerged that I really liked. So, without further ado, it's time to dive in to my top 15 favourite albums of the 2010s. And to start off, I was talking about, I said, new signature styles that have emerged during this decade that I've really liked. And one that I loved was what I'd call the Kate Bush school of indie music, or indie pop as it more so is. I'm talking people like Florence and the Machine, Bat for Lashes, Birdie, more recently Aurora. Basically artists that sort of seem quite reminiscent or inspired by Kate Bush in their style of both performance, as in with like the tribal wear and the spinning, jumping and skipping around the stage, and also in the music, with pop music that's, you know, still has catchy and with hooks, but has a more alternative production sort of sounds more organic. And I think the album that captures this sort of scene the best was, without a doubt, Truth is a Beautiful Thing by London Grammar. And this is an album of pure technical brilliance. The production is fantastic. It's sort of reminiscent of the first album by the XX. It's quite minimal, you could say, maybe a little bit trip-hoppy in sort of Massive Attack sort of sense. But it has a very grand, expansive, cinematic sound, which sounds brilliant. It's the sort where you could sort of imagine yourself as a supermodel standing in the desert. But the main component that truly make London Grammar is Hannah Reid's voice. I mean, she without a doubt has the greatest singing voice in the industry at the moment. She has all the grand power of the likes of Adele and Beyonce, yet she can also deliver a whisper as equally effectively and sleekly, yet it never sounds over-polished or fake, because when she hits those mega powerful notes, sort of like with Peter Gabriel singing, you can still hear a sort of tear in the voice that lets you know it's still a human being singing. So as you can imagine, technically brilliant tracks that just sound absolutely beautiful and grand. There are tons that you could truly imagine an epic, explosive film scene to, and just sort of send a shiver down the spine, particularly the middle section where you have Hell to the Liars, Everyone Else, and Bones of Ribbon. There's a, for my opinion, where Hannah Reid's voice is truly at its most spectacular. And now for something very different at number 14, Kanye West, Yeezus. And for me, this has been one of the big left turns in music, sort of like on par with David Bowie on Low or Radiohead on Kid A. Here you have Kanye West, R&B, oh sorry, that is the cat right there. Kanye West, commercial hip-hop superstar, and I mean commercial. He was known for funky hip-hop, he was known for a more electropop sound, he was collaborating with all the mega artists like Rihanna, Jay-Z, Kid Cudi, and here he is, making an experimental electronic album. Like, yeah, no, it's a hip-hop album, but when you look at the production list and you see Daft Punk, Gesaffelstein, Hudson Mohawke and Arca, you know he was firmly aiming for an experimental electronic sound. I remember when it came out, people were totally split over what to think of it. Like on the reviews on iTunes, there was some like 1 star, bring back the old Kanye and all that. But one of the things that made this album brilliant is that the old Kanye is still firmly alive on there. Like the sort of classic soul samples that you'd expect on his first 2 albums still pop up on tracks like Blood on the Leaves and most evidently on the ending track, Bound 2. And the sort of melancholic electronica of, what's it called, Guilt Trip is extremely reminiscent of 808s and Heartbreaks. And in fact, the more chaotic gothic sound that seems prevalent on this album was quite clear on My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, which came right before it. But yet, despite all that, there's still the strong links to the past, yet it still feels like refreshingly new and brilliant because of that. Like, it's the sort of weird I love in an album. It's sort of like so out there and weird, yet really loud and in your face of it. Like the opening track On Sight almost seems to hit you, like Aphex Twin's Come to Daddy. It's sort of like, look at me, I'm weird, and that's the sort of weird in music I absolutely love, really in your face and so incredibly bizarre that it draws you in. And particularly the case of this album, where it's so outwardly bizarre, yet so sleekly and sort of done with class the whole thing is. And one of the things that... Now, I too was part of the people who didn't like this album originally, and one of the things that I didn't like originally was the lyrics. It sort of felt like he was just rapping about, you know, money, cash, being in the upper classes of society now, and not about, you know, as he was singing about his roots, his family, where he was growing up on his first two albums. When I realised that it's not an album that's celebrating or being like, yeah, money, cash, holes sort of thing. It really is like about the paranoia and tension or the sheer overindulgence and what it can do to you of being in that sort of class of celebrity. And that really has an effect when you look at this album in context now, when you realise the troubles of mental illness that Kanye was having, and particularly during his breakdowns with the 2016 Life of Pablo tour. You really do get this sense of someone breaking down or with tons of tension and paranoia running throughout the album, particularly when you hear like the primal screaming at the end of I Am a God. So, brave new steps for the artist, in-depth lyrics to his psyche that make a ton of sense in context, and also got to talk about the album art. At first a lot of people were like, hold on, there's no album art. But I now realise sort of what the album art is, as some people have pointed out. Whenever you see this album, you're going to see it as a CD. And when people talk about CDs, it's always how they're dying out, how they're going to vanish soon. So it's, in a way, it's sort of an album that really encaptures this era as the last era of the CD. So whenever you see it, you always think of it as a CD. And I find that quite nice, personally. And also the fact that tons of artists have tried to copy it since, as in tons of albums have totally scrapped liner note art and just had a disc with art on. I've particularly seen that recently with people like the Local Natives, These New Puritans, Vince Staples, and Tori Ymois. So, it's had a huge impact in terms of its music, but in terms of the whole look and aesthetic of the album, pretty good, I think. And so we get to number 13, and back onto more styles that emerged during this decade that I absolutely loved. So these ones sort of meant more under the radar, weren't as openly acknowledged. Basically what I call the indie electronic scene, so people like James Blake, John Hopkins, Subtract, and the more UK indie R&B scene, R&B that sort of like the American counterpart was more classically, more like 70s, 80s based. You had a more chilled out, alternative sort of vibe to it. That's people like Michael Kiwanuka, Laura Mvula, Jamie Woon, and so on. But I feel the artist and album that perfectly encaptures both these scenes combined is, of course, Process by Sampha. And part of the reason I absolutely love this album is because, you know, I said it captures all the best bits of both those scenes, and that's in a way largely because Sampha heavily influenced both of them. Like, he's collaborated with pretty much most of the major artists that formed both of those scenes. The debut album of Subtract was pretty much a collaboration album with him. He's worked with Jessie Ware, worked with Katie B, and also most notably on the track Don't Touch My Hair with Solange on her album A Seat at the Table. And so you see all that talent and signature sound he's put into all these other albums over the years finally come into play on his own work. I'm not going to talk about this album too much as I've already done a review of it. But one of the main factors I'll have to say about it is, firstly, the production is brilliant. It's minimal yet lush. It's sort of doing what I think James Blake tried to do but failed, because I feel James Blake went so minimalist that it sort of became a bit bland in parts. What Sampha does is have it sort of quite minimal, so that you, as you're listening with headphones on, you unearth all the layers of sleek production that are running throughout. I mean, for instance, on Chorus Sings, you've got sort of sound African, tribal sort of sound, of sort of drum beats, the sort of soul singers in the background, and even the sound of rainfall comes in at the end. It's absolutely beautiful. It's basically not the sort of album where you put one track on and absolutely love it. It's the sort where you need to listen to it as a whole, as an album, let all the layers come just As in, so sort of, if you quickly listen to a sample of it, it won't stick in your head and you won't instantly be like, oh, that's brilliant. But it's sort of when you're sitting there with headphones on, gradually listening to it, letting it all sink in and come together as an album as a whole, you're like, wow, this is fantastic. And it's also quite an emotional album as well, or an extremely emotional album at that, because Sampha, his mother had died during the years he was making this album, and he tracks the sense of dread and loss around this event throughout, and this is most evidently done on the track "No One Knows Me Like the Piano." It's a totally like minimal track, just him on the piano. Yeah, it's really sends a shiver down your spine. It truly is like extremely personal and beautifully done. It's a track that's minimal in the best way because it's all about the lyrics. It draws you into the story and the emotions the character is going through. So yeah, basically, absolutely fantastic album. Definitely check it out. Now on to number 12. And alas, more scenes that have emerged during this decade. We've had sort of indie music that is extremely inspired by the 80s and the synthesizer sound of it. We've seen this from releases from M83 and MGMT. And then we've also had another ton of indie inspired by the psychedelic era, or the sort of lo-fi acoustic elements of the psychedelic era. It's basically people like Unknown Mortal Coil, Mac DeMarco, Pond, Temples, the Claypool Lennon Delirium. But of course, we all know which artist set up this new indie psychedelic scene. But the album I want to talk about is the one where they took on the new synthesizer sound of indie as well. And so that brings me to the album Currents by Tame Impala. It's an album that just is pure feel-good. It's all the good emotions I love in music, sort of in one album. It's got a sort of quite a heartfelt, melancholic sort of sound on some of the more emotional, like sort of sadder tracks, like Yes, I'm Changing. But it's got a really sort of funky, upbeat, yet really chilled out sort of vibe. You can sort of relax to it, yet also dance to it. Yeah, it's so sleekly done that you could put it on at any party with any people's music taste. You could play it to a hip-hop fan, to a major pop fan, and it really works. This is why an album that is sold so much. It just somehow has that. It's so great that it has a great appeal all round to music fans all round. And yes, with that last bit, I am talking about the track "The Less I Know, the Better." It still has quite a grand. It still combines both elements of Tame Impala really well. It has the funky 80s sound that you sort of could imagine coming from the likes of, say, Foreigner runnings right throughout. It also still keeps loyal to the psychedelic sound he had before, and you find it's most evident on the track Let It Happen, which has a sort of epic scale you can imagine a sort of prog rock track, and the sort of guitar solo and music video that really brings to mind the sort of mind-expanding wackiness of a psychedelic scene. But yeah, I basically just can't give enough love to this album. It's just bloody great. Sometimes that's all you can say with some albums. It's just great artistry, great skill, and you definitely get that from Kevin Parker, who, as we know, is a ultra perfectionist producer. Like, he'll spend tons of time on the album, and yes, that is what a perfectionist does. So now we go to number 11, and when I was younger, so about 11, so just entering this decade, I was fully an electronic fan. I mean, my dream was to be a DJ, and that's because it was the peak of when electronic dance music had come back as the main form in pop, with the likes of David Guetta and Deadmau5. But I also truly got into electronica because there was something brilliant happening here locally in the UK, and that was the UK bass movement. Basically, some of the production elements of dubstep that emerged in the late 2000s with Scream, Benga and Burial were now being made a part of the popular music or electronic dance music that was entering the charts. And it felt like this big new scene of fresh, brilliant electronic music was happening. Basically, people like Example, KTB, the aforementioned Subtract, Magnetic Man, Wretch 32, DJ Fresh. And I think the album that best encaptures this whole scene is No More Idols by Chase and Status. Like, all the tracks feel loud and grand. They all have this big anthemic rave status. And for some reason, all these tracks still sound really cool and fresh a whole, like, almost 10 years later from when they were released. And I feel that somehow that Chase and Status have captured the sort of really dark urban grittiness that the likes of Massive Attack had, yet they've managed to translate it perfectly to the rave scene of the early 2010s, and it just sounds great. Even now, I said, it's ultra sleek, ultra cool, but in a quite a gritty, dark way, yet in a way you can still party hard to at the raves. And it's what I quite like it as a nice sort of time capsule of a scene gone by, because there's tons of artists where we don't really think of them now, but at the time of this album being released, they were the pop or commercial music megastars. So when you see people like Tiny Temper, CeeLo Green, Plan B, all these artists that were absolutely massive yet have now sort of faded away along the lines, but yet also the music that could have been. It shows all the urban artists of the time that were being built up to be the next big thing but never quite made it. You've got Maverick Sabre, who in my opinion should have been ultra massive. His album he released last year, When I Wake Up, was absolutely brilliant. Definitely check it out. I mean, Temper T, Delilah, White Lies, all the could have beens in music as well. So still sounds ultra sleek, still sounds fully cool and gritty, and also is quite a nice nostalgic time capsule to a scene in music that I don't think will get looked on with, like, you know, critical rewritings, but to us that lived through it, it was special and we loved it. And so, keeping along the electronic track, now you get to number 10 with the other artist that made me really want to be a DJ at the time, Daft Punk, Random Access Memories. And Daft Punk really are an act that have changed music for the better. Well, they pretty much kick-started France as a major player in electronic music by kick-starting the French electronic scene and bringing it to international attention. As a result of that, we've had the success of Air, Phoenix, M83, Geschaffelstein and Kavinsky. They've pretty much set off the huge craze for new disco music in the late 90s and early 2000s, which as a result gave us the likes of Armand van Helden, the Shapeshifters, Etienne de Clichy, and tons of hyper-catchy music. And he sort of unknowingly left a huge impact on the music of this decade, like firstly in the rise of the future funk subgenre, a whole genre that is pretty much just taking from their album Discovery with a distinctly 70s sampling, hyperactive, funky dance music with, you know, anime imagery perfectly matching like the music videos for these singles from the Discovery album. But with this album, Daft Punk have once again left an impact on music that has changed things for the better, and that is the return of the 80s, but in the form of funk. This is something they continued with their collaborations with The Weeknd on his track Starboy and I Feel It Coming. Yet this also spread to other artists. Like after Get Lucky, you had tons of cases of artists were after another Get Lucky, and pretty much the classic 80s funk and soul style soon became just a major part of the pop music of this decade. After them, we had the collaborations with Mark Ronson, we had Bruno Mars, we had the stuff from Childish Gambino. Yeah, aside from just changing the music of this decade for the better, this is just a fantastically done album. I sort of like with the Tame Impala album I mentioned earlier, sometimes it just feels really good. It's music where there's just so much like... It's music that's just good. It's just chilled out. It makes you feel good. You want to dance to it. And Daft Punk have that signature sound and chord brilliance that runs through their entire career and is especially evident on here. You've got tons of tracks that are signature Daft Punk, particularly The Game of Love, where you have, you know, the signature mournful robot vocals that bring you back to tracks like Something About Us. It also shows them trying something new. It's a great concept album that is a tribute to the disco era. It brings back to life some of the classic, you know, guitar licks and production styles of disco. Yet it also brings back tons of the core players in disco on here as collaborators. So obviously the interview with Giorgio Moroder on Giorgio by Moroder, and Nile Rodgers being a presence throughout. Yet also the sheer signature Daft Punk creativity is back again, adding more variety to the sound. Contact is an outer space epic you could sort of imagine going with the Stargate sequence at the end of 2001. And Touch is almost like an 8-minute Broadway musical epic with vocals from Paul Williams, who was the guy who voiced the Penguin in Batman the Animated Series. The more you know. So changing music for the better in this decade, one of the absolute greats of electronic music, bringing their core feel-good sound back to it, a loving tribute to the disco era, and tons of creativity running throughout. Yeah, it's a good one.